Good evening, everyone. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Hetal sir and Team TAS for giving me this opportunity today. The initiative of Facebook Live Challenge and TED Talks started by TAS reminds me of this. न चौरहार्यं न च राजहार्यं न भ्रातृभाज्यं न च भारकारी व्यये कृते वर्धते एव नित्यं विद्याधनं सर्वधनप्रधानम्. Education or knowledge is such a wealth that cannot be stolen or abducted. Neither can it be divided, nor is it burdensome. In fact, it is such a wealth that goes on increasing by sharing or giving and is supreme of all possessions. And TAS indeed is doing an amazing job by spreading knowledge through this global platform. I bring you all greetings from my institute, Srimati Kashibai Navle Medical College and General Hospital, Pune. In the current pandemic, our institute is in the forefront to treat COVID patients in and around Pune. With the hope that all of us shall fare through this ordeal and with the blessings of the Goddess of Knowledge and Wisdom, Goddess Saraswati, I begin my presentation. My topic for today is induction strategies for compromised pediatric airway. So, what is a compromised airway? It implies partial obstruction to airflow and constant threat of total obstruction if relaxation of muscles of the upper airways narrows the air passages. Why do we need to discuss this topic? A trial published in the Lancet Respiratory Medicine, it is a multicentric trial that was conducted across 13 pediatric centers and included more than 1,000 children with difficult airways, and what this trial concluded is airway management in a pediatric difficult airway population is associated with significant complication. 20% children in this trial had at least one complication related to airway management. Most common severe complication was cardiac arrest, which was seen in 2% of children, and the most common overall complication was transient hypoxemia. Coming to pediatric airway, as we all know, it is not just a miniature airway, but it is a different airway. Failure to manage the airway is the most common cause of mortality and serious morbidity in children undergoing anesthesia. 1/3 of anesthesia deaths in children are due to failure to intubate and ventilate the child. Airway anatomy and respiratory physiology present unique challenges and make the child more prone to develop hypoxia as compared to the adult counterparts. Also, the possibility and the feasibility of performing an awake intubation is limited because it is difficult to reason with the child the need of his or her cooperation. In addition to the clinical aspects, the psychosocial aspects of the peri-induction period also need to be addressed by the anesthetist, and hence the pediatric airway demands creative modification of difficult airway management scenario. A comprehensive history is an important part of assessment, and one must not miss the red flags pointing towards a possible compromised airway. A child with a history of snoring, apnea, or noisy breathing is definitely prone to airway compromise during induction, emergence, as well as postoperatively. The same holds true for a child who prefers to lie prone or on one side, and such history should be elicited. History of daytime somnolence indicates obstructive sleep apnea. Hoarseness or diminished cry is due to acute inflammation of the airway. Cough, especially if it is a sudden onset cough, it indicates foreign body aspiration. It is important to elicit history of previous anesthesia, and if so, the records must be reviewed, as we must know the previous anesthesia induction techniques as well as the airway management techniques which were successful as well as unsuccessful in the past. Both of these are an important piece of information. A word of caution over here, however, in children, the airway dimensions and dynamics change over time, especially if the child is syndromic, and in certain syndromes like the Treacher-Collins syndrome and the Apert syndrome, it is a known fact that the airway deteriorates with time, and hence a previous uneventful anesthesia exposure does not guarantee the same always, and one must be prepared for it. Coming to examination, examination of a child is one of an opportunity and one must make the most of it. Avoid upsetting or stressing the child with a compromised airway, as it will further compromise the airway which is already at stake. Various points can be picked up from general examination of the child, which will help us in deciding the induction strategy. Coming to body mass index, obesity no doubt is a significant predictor of airway compromise, but failure to thrive is also a recognized consequence of obstructed sleep disordered breathing, especially with adenotonsillar hypertrophy. Certain dysmorphic features are pertinent to syndromes, and they include midfacial hypoplasia, micrognathia, and macroglossia, and definitely put the airway at risk. Various syndromes affect the neck mobility, and it definitely has implications while handling the airway during induction. Syndromes such as the Klippel-Feil syndrome are associated with cervical spine fusion and limit the neck mobility, and hence affect the visualization of the larynx during intubation. Down syndrome and certain mucopolysaccharidoses are associated with cervical spine instability, and this mandates extreme caution, and one must avoid neck movements during mask holding, laryngoscopy as well as intubation. In a child with an overt respiratory distress, it is important to assess which phase of respiration is affected. Crowing on inspiration is due to extrathoracic lesions. A noisy exhalation points towards extrathoracic location of the lesion, and when both the phases of respiration are affected, the lesion is most likely to be at or just above the thoracic inlet. Weak or absent cry indicates affection of the larynx. Most importantly, if the child cries during examination, do not forget to assess the mouth opening, the configuration of hard and soft palate, and the relative size of the tongue. Now, these are the various syndromes and the characteristics of airway associated with each syndrome. Also important is the non-airway related clinical associations of syndromes such as cardiac lesions, susceptibility to malignant hypothermia, and signs of raised ICT, which must not be missed because they definitely have a bearing in deciding the induction strategy. Now, this is the assessment of breathing which is recommended by the Advanced Pediatric Life Support, and I found it very useful. So, they categorize the parameters to be evaluated into effort of breathing, efficacy of breathing, and effect of respiratory failure on other systems. Effort of breathing can be assessed from the respiratory rate, presence of added sounds like stridor, wheeze, or grunting, recession of the chest wall, accessory muscle usage, and flaring of nostrils. Efficacy of breathing can be assessed by observing the chest expansion, abdominal excursion, auscultation, and from oxygen saturation. In severe cases, the respiratory failure does affect the other systems, and that can be gauged from the heart rate of the child, skin color, and in extreme cases, the mental status of the child can also be affected. Now, Kapur score is an important score in assessing the airway. There are 5 parameters which are graded from 1 to 4. C stands for view of chin from the side. If it is normal, it is to 1. A small chin is grade 2. Markedly recessive chin is 3. And extremely hypoplastic chin is graded as 4. O stands for opening or the interdental space. If it is more than 40 millimeters, it is 1. 20 to 40 millimeters is 2. 10 to 20 millimeters is 3. And less than 10 millimeters is 4. P stands for previous intubations or obstructive sleep apnea. If the previous attempt at intubation was easy, it is graded as 1. If there is no previous attempt, it is 2. If previous attempt at intubation was difficult, or if the child has obstructive sleep apnea, it is 3. And extremely difficult previous intubation is 4. U is uvula. If the tip is visible, it is 1. If uvula is only partially visible, 2. Uvula concealed with soft palate visible, 3. And soft palate not visible is 4. R is the range of movement across an imaginary line from the ear to the orbit. If this range is more than 120 degrees, it is 1. 60 to 120 degrees is 2. 30 to 60 degrees is 3. And less than 30 degrees is 4. There are additional points given for certain attributes, such as 1 point is given for each characteristics like prominent front buck teeth, very large tongue, and extreme obesity, and 2 points are given for mucopolysaccharidosis. Now, if we do a sum total of these points, we not only get an assessment of the airway, but also it gives us a rough guide as to the induction strategy for the airway. So, if the sum total is 5 to 7, it indicates easy normal intubation. 8 to 10, Laryngeal pressure may help in intubation. Score of more than 10 predicts a difficult airway. If the score is 12, fiber optic may be less traumatic. If it is 14, fiber optic and other advanced techniques must definitely be available before inducing the child. And 16 is a dangerous airway and the anesthetist must consider awake intubation, and also arrangement must be made for potential tracheostomy in this airway. Now, clinically, this is a very important classification which classifies the airway into normal, impaired, and abnormal. This helps us to decide the airway management and induction strategy. So, what is a normal airway? It is an airway which externally looks normal and there is no distress. So, this is what we otherwise call as an unexpected difficult airway, and if encountered, it requires a simple, intuitive, established, and algorithm-based approach. Impaired airway is a normal airway with distress due to an acute illness. It could be anything like an inflammation of the airway or airway allergy or trauma or burns of the airway. And obviously the severity of the disease and the speed of deterioration of the acute illness will dictate the approach to this airway. Resuscitation and airway equipment must be available, and most importantly, a ENT or surgical person should be available while inducing this patient or while handling this airway. Abnormal airway is rare, but it presents electively. This is what we otherwise commonly know as the anticipated difficult airway, and the key is maintenance of spontaneous respiration, because a spontaneously breathing child allows the anesthetist to use alternative techniques as time is available as compared to when the child is paralyzed, and time is a most important factor for success in these situations. Now, coming to the anticipated compromised airway, what should be the game plan or how should we go about it? So, it mandates a well-considered strategy, proper preoperative planning, relative benefit of the planned surgery. In fact, even the need of surgery must be weighed against the possible risks of anesthesia management. This must be discussed with the surgeon so that the way forward can be planned. Skilled help must be available, including the surgeon. The surgeon must be included from every step, right from the preoperative planning, deciding the anesthesia plan, till the actual induction and management of the airway, as it is a team approach. And most importantly, one must be ready to change the plan if the primary plan fails. Always a bottom line plan must be available, and flexibility to change the plan is the most important factor for successful management of anticipated difficult airway. Now, when we are dealing with a compromised airway, there are a number of things which need to be discussed, and this discussion should take place at the earliest possible time depending upon how emergent or how elective the surgery is. So, what all should be discussed? The anesthesia plan, the choice of particular technique and why you have chosen this technique must be discussed with the parents to the best of their understanding, and also with the surgeon. Possibility of surgical airway such as tracheostomy should be discussed. The more urgent the surgery, the more important the discussion of a possible emergency tracheostomy. The bottom line or alternative plan, as I mentioned earlier, should be thought through well in advance, and all the discussions and plans must be clearly documented. Now, while handling a difficult airway or a compromised airway, there are various points or junctures which put the anesthetist into a fix or dilemma. First and foremost is the premedication, whether to premedicate the child or not. If we do not premedicate the child on the basis of safety concerns, we have a real problem of having a terrified child with a potentially difficult airway in the anesthesia room. He'll be crying, producing secretions. He'll not allow placement of monitors or intravenous cannula or even mask for that matter. And the crying may further deteriorate the airway. As opposed to it, if titrated premedication is actually given to the child, we have the advantage of inducing the child in a smooth and calm atmosphere with full monitoring applied as a priority, and this definitely adds considerable safety to the process of induction. However, The decision must be based on individual circumstances of the case. A small sedative pre-medication in the form of oral midazolam 0.3 to 0.5 milligram per kg is given 25 minutes before surgery or before induction. It definitely helps. Antimuscarinics are actually given for the anti-sialagogue effect, that is, they dry up the secretions, but the added advantage is that they support the heart rate during induction as well. Atropine, if given orally, 30 to 40 microgram per kg should be given. The peak is at 90 minutes. And intramuscularly, dose is 20 microgram per kg, which peaks at 25. The effect peaks at 25 minutes. So accordingly, the pre-medication must be timed. Now, inhalational induction is the favored technique in children. Gaseous induction is done with sevoflurane in 100% oxygen with full monitoring applied. Once there is loss of consciousness, an intravenous cannula, if it is already not in place, it can be placed. Sometimes the child does not allow mask ventilation or mask induction, or in certain features like in hemifacial abnormalities, it is not possible to achieve an adequate mask fit, and hence inhalational induction is not feasible. In such cases, titrated intravenous induction agents can be used till loss of consciousness. Propofol 1 to 1.5 milligram per kg or ketamine 1 to 2 milligram per kg can be given as per the merits of the case. The most important point is preservation of spontaneous respiration. Then the anesthesia can be deepened either with inhalational or intravenous agent to a plane where laryngoscopy can take place. I again would emphasize that preserving spontaneous respiration is most important for the safety as well as for the success of airway management in these situations. Now we'll be discussing a few cases. My first case, he is an 8-year-old child. He is an operated case of TM joint ankylosis, but the previous surgery has failed and he was posted for gap arthroplasty. His mouth opening was still nil and it had affected his oral intake significantly, and hence he was weighing just 15 kg. Looking at the airway, if we assess the Koppur score, C, that is the chin is severely hypoplastic, so that is 4. Mouth opening was negligible, so that is also 4. Previous intubation was difficult, so it gives him the P is 3. Uvula on soft palate is not visible, so U is graded 4, and the range of movement was normal, so R is 1. That gives us a Koppur of 16. If you see the X-ray carefully, there are also buck teeth, so we can add one more point for that, so it will actually make it 17. But nonetheless, it was a dangerous airway with a score of 16, and one must consider awake intubation and potential for tracheostomy. Accordingly, a plan of anesthesia, or plan A, was awake fiber optic nasotracheal intubation. The child being 8 years, we had counseled him adequately at the preoperative visit. On the day of surgery, intramuscular glycopyrrolate was given. He was nebulized with lignocaine. Nasal oxymetazoline drops were administered and he was wheeled in the OR, where he was given midazolam 0.2 milligram and fentanyl was given in 15 microgram aliquots after applying all the monitors and giving 100% oxygen to the child. The airway blocks were given with transtracheal and superior laryngeal nerve blocks with 2% lignocaine. The child actually cooperated to the blocks. Then we had cut a 4.5 uncuffed endotracheal tube and lubricated it and passed it through the less patent nostril to be used as a nasopharyngeal airway during induction. The JR circuit was attached to it and the child was maintained on spontaneous respiration with oxygen and sevoflurane. Fiber optic bronchoscopy with a pediatric fiber optic bronchoscope was performed through the more patent nostril and a 5-number uncuffed endotracheal tube was passed and the placement of the tube confirmed. The principle we followed over here was maintenance of spontaneous respiration till establishment of ventilation with a definitive airway. As an effect of counseling and because of the age of the child, he definitely cooperated to the entire procedure and it was relatively uneventful, but we nonetheless had our backup plan ready. Just in case the child did not cooperate, we had kept an intravenous infusion of dexmedetomidine ready to sedate the child during the intubation, and also considering the need for potential tracheostomy, ENT surgeon was available all throughout in the operation theatre till the confirmation of endotracheal tube placement. Now this is a table which guides us to a particular size of endotracheal tube if it is required in a child. Through which LMA can the tube be passed? For example, if it is a 2.5 number tube which the child will take approximately from the formulas which are available, it can be passed through an LMA number 1, and it can be railroaded over a fiber optic bronchoscope having an outer diameter of 2 mm or airway exchange catheter having a diameter of 7 French. So this table is really useful in pediatric patients. Now coming to airway compromise. Now the compromise can either occur early or late. Early compromise is when we face difficulty in mask ventilation. So what could be the causes? It could be either related to the equipment problems or failure, which include the mask, the circuit, the oxygen supply, or they could be related to the patient. Anatomical problems include poor head positioning of the child, large adenoids or tonsils, or airway obstruction from cricoid pressure if it is being used. Functional problems can be further divided into upper airway obstruction or lower airway obstruction. Upper airway obstruction occurs most commonly due to inadequate depth of anesthesia and or laryngospasm. Lower airway problems could be related to inflation of the stomach, which is very common in infants, affecting the mask ventilation, or it could be bronchospasm or chest wall rigidity. So when encountered with early compromise, what are the troubleshoots? First and foremost, administer 100% oxygen and call for help. Equipment problems must be excluded quickly and the faulty equipment must be replaced. Here lies the importance of a self-inflating bag, which must always be present in the OR, and it must be confirmed and checked before inducing the child. How to rectify the patient factors? Adjustment of head position. If the child is less than 2 years, a shoulder roll helps. If the child is more than 2 years, a neutral position is more beneficial. Simple airway opening maneuvers like head tilt, chin lift and jaw thrust. Application of continuous positive airway pressure. Adjustment of cricoid pressure if it is been used can improve mask ventilation. Insertion of the airways, a nasal airway if the child is in lighter planes, or an oral airway, oropharyngeal airway if the child is deep enough. Most of the times deepening of anesthesia also improves mask ventilation. Ventilate with a 2-person technique with one person holding the mask with both the hands and other person squeezing the bag. Passing of nasogastric tube to deflate the stomach especially helps in infants. All throughout these steps, it is important to administer nasal oxygen for passive oxygenation of the child. If in spite of this mask ventilation is still not possible, the first recommendation, if you have an LMA available, LMA must be inserted. If oxygenation and ventilation through the LMA is adequate, one can proceed to surgery with the LMA, or fiber optic intubation can be done through the LMA. If the LMA is not available, or otherwise, the second recommendation is deepen the child, visualize the cords and intubate. Muscle relaxation has also been recommended over here, but one must always keep in mind when giving a muscle relaxant the possibility for a CICV situation, and one must be thoroughly prepared if a CICV is encountered. Any time in doubt, the child must be awakened. So this is the same steps which we have discussed in the algorithmic form, which is published by the APA. Now, if the compromise is late, that is, if difficulties encountered during laryngoscopy and tracheal intubation. The key point is that if tracheal intubation fails, do not simply repeat what has just failed, as multiple attempts at intubation may traumatize the airway and cause airway edema, making intubation impossible. And each subsequent attempt therefore should include either changing the position of the child, changing the equipment or using alternative aids or adjuncts, and changing the personnel. So attempt laryngoscopy and intubation. If it fails the first attempt, consider repositioning, try alternative laryngoscope if available, and change personnel. If it fails, insert LMA and perform fiber optic intubation via LMA. This is in simplified form. Intubation attempts must be limited to a maximum of 3, and the third attempt has to be by an anesthesiologist expert in pediatric anesthesia. Most of the times, visualization of larynx and intubation are successful with proper positioning, external laryngeal manipulation, adequate depth, and muscle paralysis. Important points to note here are: blind intubation through a LMA is not recommended, and attempts at fiber optic intubation should be limited to 2. So what are the alternative techniques or aids that we have at our disposal? Simple aids like Stellet and bougie definitely help us. Even if the laryngeal view is poor, the child can be intubated. Straight blades are useful in older children and those with micrognathia or macroglossia. McCoy-Levering laryngoscope with a severed blade improves laryngeal view, particularly if the view is obstructed by a large epiglottis. So this is a McCoy-Levering laryngoscope with a severed blade. We have rigid indirect laryngoscopes which help in intubation in children, and we'll just discuss them shortly. If in spite of all these techniques, if the larynx is not visualized, a second generation supraglottic airway device is recommended. If insertion of supraglottic device also fails, then we have to resort back to the face mask ventilation, which is now known as the rescue mask ventilation. So coming to indirect laryngoscopes, they are non-guided devices, guided devices, and optical stillets. As the name suggests, non-guided device will just provide an indirect view, but it will require a manual direction of the tracheal tube towards the larynx. Examples include Bullard laryngoscope, GlideScope, Stotz DCI, video laryngoscope, and Stotz CMAC laryngoscope. So as you can see on the left side of the slide, this is the GlideScope, Stotz CMAC, video laryngoscope, and Bullard laryngoscope. And guided devices, they provide indirect view and act as a conduit for passage of tracheal tube. And the classic example is the AirTrack. As you can see that it provides the indirect view as well as has a channel for guiding the tube in the larynx. And the third are optical stillets. They are rigid and semi-rigid stillet with a loaded tracheal tube for railroading. So these are the Bonfils, Shikani, and the Lightwand. This is the Bonfils stillet, this is the Lightwand, and this is the Shikani optical stillet. They are especially useful in children with micrognathia. So coming to the algorithmic representation. Step 1 is laryngoscopy and tracheal intubation. If unable to intubate during the first attempt at direct or video laryngoscopy, continue nasal oxygen. One more attempt at intubation only if the saturation is 95%, and the final and the third attempt only by the anesthesiologist with pediatric experience. Continue mask ventilation between attempts. Optimize position. Use external laryngeal manipulation. Use bougie or Stellet if required, and consider changing the device, technique, or operator between the attempts, and maintain depth of anesthesia. As soon as the first attempt at intubation fails, since then, always call for help at every step. If any time the laryngoscopy and tracheal intubation is successful, confirm the tracheal placement of the tube using capnography. If it is a failed intubation, however, after 3 attempts, resume mask ventilation with 100% oxygen, and the next step is to insert a supraglottic device to maintain oxygenation. Again, continue nasal oxygen. Preferably second generation device is preferred. Maximum 2 attempts at insertion of supraglottic device, that too if the saturation is more than or equal to 95%. Mask ventilation between attempts again. Consider changing the size and type of supraglottic device if the fit is not adequate, and maintain the depth of anesthesia. Now, if supraglottic device insertion and oxygenation is successful, then we have the following options. Either wake up the child. If it is considered safe, continue anesthesia using the supraglottic device, or intubate through the supraglottic device using fiber optic bronchoscope only, provided expertise is available, and tracheostomy. If ventilation through supraglottic device also fails, again call for help if it is not arrived, and what we do is a rescue mask ventilation now. Why is it called rescue? Because we ventilate the child and maintain his saturation till either he wakes up or till surgical help is available. So, continue nasal oxygen, ensure neuromuscular blockage. This is an important step over here because it does improve mask ventilation. Final attempt at face mask ventilation using optimal technique and oral or nasal airways, and consider insertion of gastric tube. If mask ventilation is successful, ventilate the child and maintain oxygenation till the time you can wake up the child. However, if rescue mask ventilation is also not successful, complete ventilation failure is declared, and we'll discuss it in the upcoming slides. So now this is the second case. It is a 1-year-old baby. This is his chest x-ray. As you can see that there is a consolidated patch in the left lower zone and also in the mid zone. He presented with history of recurrent LRTI and was posted for rigid bronchoscopy. Now the child was induced with intravenous anesthesia and succinylcholine, was mask ventilated with 100% oxygen, and was then handed over to the surgeon, who then inserted the rigid bronchoscope. After insertion of bronchoscope, we continued ventilating the child through the ventilating port of the bronchoscope, and he was maintained on oxygen and sevoflurane and intermittent scoling. So it was found that the child had aspirated a peanut and a few bits of peanut were removed. Intermittently, whenever the saturation dropped, we resorted to mask ventilation after removing the rigid bronchoscope. At a certain point, however, when few bits of the foreign body were removed, there was a precipitous drop in saturation. So obviously the bronchoscope was removed by the surgeon and we resorted to mask ventilation with 100% oxygen. The saturations, however, did not pick up. So the next step obviously was to intubate the child. So the child was intubated and ventilated through the endotracheal tube. However, the saturation still not budge. They were still hovering in a lower range. So we auscultated the child. The air entry was almost negligible on the left, as similar to the preoperative status. But the air entry on the right, there was only minimal air entry present at the bases. So we thought that the tube must be blocked with secretions, and hence we removed it and reinserted a new tube. However, the saturations still not improve, and the child started developing bradycardia, which was managed with atropine. We were really desperate at this time, but one decision at this point which changed the entire scenario was that we allowed the surgeon to put in a bronchoscope and have a fast view of the airway so as to find out the cause for this precipitous drop in the saturations. Once the bronchoscope was passed, it was found that a big piece of peanut had slipped into the right bronchus and was obstructing it. The peanut was removed, intubation was done after removing the bronchoscope, and the child ventilated and the saturations actually picked up. The point I want to make here is, while managing the airway or sharing the airway, we need to be continuously vigilant and alert, and also in sync with the surgical step what is going on. And also the airway parameters or the dynamics are changing from moment to moment. Hence, one must be thorough with the physiological changes that take place at each step and what one should anticipate. So this is the postoperative X-ray of the child. Now coming to the next case, this is a 4-month baby who had a swelling under the base of the tongue since birth. It was a ranula, and he presented with stridor and difficulty in breathing, and also feeding difficulty. Here there was failure to breastfeeding, and the mother gave history of multiple aspirations of the swelling in the past, but it used to refill. So this was the size of the swelling when he was posted at our institute. Looking at the swelling, our initial plan of anesthesia was to aspirate it under sedation, maintaining spontaneous respiration, and after a considerable amount of swelling has been aspirated, induce the child and intubate him after reduction in size of the swelling. However, on the day of surgery, we changed our plan because when the surgeon palpated the swelling, it was found to have intraoral as well as extraoral components which were freely communicable, and it was a compressible swelling, and it was easily and effortlessly possible to reduce the intraoral part into the extraoral part. So On the day of surgery, we changed our plan. We pre-medicated the child, induced with propofol and oxygen sevoflurane in titrated doses, but here again we maintained spontaneous respiration. Gentle laryngoscopy was done and the child was intubated with number 3 uncuffed endotracheal tube, the stillet tip with a stillet, and the stillet tip was straightened for guiding the tube easily into the larynx. The principle followed here again was maintenance of spontaneous ventilation till we confirmed the endotracheal tube placement. The child was then maintained on atracurium. The entire swelling was marsupialized and removed, and the child was reversed and extubated as per merits at the end of surgery. Now this case I have specifically included to show this assembly. This is the assembly which we use, wherein the JR circuit is attached to the working channel of the fiber optic bronchoscope via connection of the IV set rubber connection. So this we use for diagnostic fiber optic bronchoscopies because in these cases the working channel is rarely used. Now this child, he was a 8-day-old baby, he was a 32-weeker and had recurrent episodes of cyanosis. They were aggravated on crying and relieved on lying down on the side. The child was intubated twice for the same and hence he was now posted for diagnostic fiber optic bronchoscopy to rule out laryngomalacia. After applying all the monitors, we used minimal doses of midazolam and fentanyl to sedate the child, and they were enough for the child to tolerate the procedure. The assisted ventilation was continued through this assembly via the working channel, and we successfully completed the procedure. Here, maintenance of spontaneous respiration was not only safe as similar to the previous cases, but in this case it was even desirable to have a spontaneously breathing child because we had to assess the vocal cord movements and also the functional anatomy of the larynx with respect to the phases of respiration. Now coming to the last prong of the airway algorithm, difficult airway algorithm, is complete ventilation failure. Though very rare, one must be well versed with the rescue techniques which are available if one faces a complete ventilation failure scenario. Now these techniques are definitely challenging in infants and small children and they are prone to complications and hence they should be performed only in life-threatening situations. In children, the trachea is small, flaccid, mobile and prone to collapse during insertion of transtracheal device. There are also chances of injury to the posterior tracheal wall while placement of the transtracheal device. The cricothyroid membrane, which is easily accessible in adults, it is difficult to locate it in pediatric patients due to a different orientation of laryngeal cartilage and it increases the chances of laryngeal trauma. Also, the membrane is smaller than the smallest tracheal tubes available, the average size of the membrane being 2.6 by 3 millimeters. And it is rather easier to locate the space between the tracheal rings as compared to the cricothyroid membrane. Hence, whenever surgical help is available, a surgical tracheostomy is preferred over needle cricothyroidotomy till 8 years of age. However, surgical help may not always be available, and if the surgical help is not available and the child is less than 5 years, the rescue technique which is indicated is transtracheal needle puncture, and if 5 to 8 years, needle cricothyrotomy can be done if surgical help is not available. So coming back to the airway algorithm, if we see this complete ventilation failure, it calls for emergency surgical airway access. Again, continue nasal oxygen and efforts at rescue mask ventilation and perform one of the following techniques. In any child, if surgical help is available, always go for tracheostomy. If surgical help is not available and the child is less than 5 years, transtracheal needle puncture. And if the child is 5 to 8 years, needle cricothyroidotomy. If the child is more than 8 years, needle cricothyrotomy can be performed, but use pressure regulated jet ventilation and attempt to keep the upper airway patent. These are most important considerations. Now, the airway algorithms which we discussed so far definitely are a valuable tool. They help us in familiarizing ourselves to the difficult airway scenarios and also help us formulate a protocol or plan just in case we encounter a difficult airway scenario. However, the drawback is that they are usually not available in the format where they can be used in real time, that is when we are actually facing the airway crisis. In contrast, what we now have is the Vortex tool, which has recently been designed. It is an implementation tool and it is specifically designed to be used in real time in case of an actually evolving airway emergency. So it is available in a universal template which can be used by clinicians as well as paramedics who are involved in advanced airway management. So this tool, it is based on a simple premise that 3 airway lifelines. So what are lifelines? They are the non-surgical airways which are available. So 3 airway lifelines exist to establish and confirm alveolar ventilation. So these lifelines are basically the face mask, the supraglottic device and the endotracheal tube. Whenever alveolar ventilation is confirmed with any of these lifelines, it takes us to the outward zone or the green zone. Once we are in the green zone, it gives an indication to the clinician that he has adequate time available and he can think about options to optimize the airway further. However, if the alveolar ventilation is not satisfactory for each lifeline, one must consider manipulation of head and neck, larynx or device, use of adjuncts, size and type of the device, suction and oxygen flow must be confirmed, and alteration of muscle tone, like if muscle paralysis is required, it must be given taking adequate care. If best effort at each of these lifelines is unsuccessful, it culminates into a spiral movement to the central zone. If you see the vortex, its shape, it narrows down as we go to the base. So narrowing of the funnel indicates that decreased time and options are now available and it leads to a spiral descent deeper into the vortex. This is the upper view of the vortex. As you see, the center is dark blue. So this center of the funnel evokes recognition of potential for worsening hypoxemia and cyanosis, and whenever this is indicated, one must simultaneously consider surgical options. So it indicates that a CICO, cannot intubate, cannot oxygenate situation exists and CICO rescue must be simultaneously initiated, which includes a front of neck surgical access. And if you see, the center is again green, that means that if CICO rescue is established in time, alveolar oxygenation can again be established. So, from all the algorithms as well as the implementation tool, it is clear that supraglottic devices definitely have a distinctive role, more so in pediatric airway because various studies have shown that failure of supraglottic device in pediatrics, the incidence is much less as compared to adults. And a distinctive study which I would like to mention over here, it was carried out on 34 children who had dysmorphic features and mucopolysaccharide disorders. In them, when supraglottic device was used, no child demonstrated a poor airway fit. In fact, in all the children, the airway position was either good or adequate, and this was not just by the EtCO2. This position was confirmed by passing a fiber optic bronchoscope and assessing the laryngeal view which it provided. So they are definitely central to the airway management. They are not only an alternative to intubation, but they are the most effective conduit for fiber optic intubation, and most important is their role as a rescue airway in failed intubation or ventilation scenario. And they must be a part of difficult airway armamentarium with each anesthetist. Now, since we are discussing the airway, I would just mention the salient and the pertinent modifications which we must follow, which are recommended in the COVID-19 scenario presently. Please keep in mind that these are just recommendations, as we do not have any robust evidence still, as the data is still emerging. So these are recommendations by the Pediatric Difficult Intubation Collaborative. So what do they recommend? Anxiolytic medication must preferably be administered in a child because a crying child is more likely to generate aerosols. However, nasal administration of pre-medication is undesirable owing to the nasal viral load, and also it elicits sneezing and coughing, producing droplets and aerosols. Parental presence is not recommended while inducing a child in COVID scenario for two reasons: to save the PPEs or to conserve the PPEs, and also to reduce the risk of healthcare workers to the virus exposure. Intravenous induction is definitely preferred over inhalational induction due to concerns about aerosol, but the induction technique should be at the discretion of the anesthetist. If he feels that gaining an IV access or induction is going to be difficult or troublesome, and it will lead to struggling and crying of the child, which again can generate aerosols, inhalational induction can definitely be done. But if inhalational induction is done, use lowest possible fresh gas flows, ensure tight seal of the mask, avoid bag and mask ventilation, and always use a transparent plastic barrier at the anesthesia elbow. The induction, otherwise, a rapid sequence induction or a modified rapid sequence induction is the technique of choice. Tracheal intubation should be done with video laryngoscopes. Cuffed tracheal tubes are recommended over uncuffed tube. Suction should always be inline. High quality viral filters. Two viral filters are recommended. One positioned between the patient's airway and breathing circuit, and the second at the end of the expiratory limb. The child should be extubated deep to avoid coughing. The depth can be maintained either by intravenous agents or by dexmedetomidine. WHO recommends use of protective barriers in all phases of care to reduce viral dispersion. A suction device has to be placed under the barrier to create a negative microenvironment to scavenge the droplets and the aerosols. Most important, modification of workflow. The patient should recover in the OR itself and should be directly shifted to the ward. This will decrease or avoid the exposure of the PSU staff. Appropriate PPE is recommended when performing an aerosol generating procedure, even in the child without any symptoms. So the collaborative, it ranked difficult airway approaches as follows. The primary technique indicated is a video laryngoscopy. If it is not available, fiber optic intubation through supraglottic device. The third in rank is a combined video laryngoscopy and fiber optic bronchoscopy if problem is encountered when using both these techniques individually. And finally, freehand fiber optic. Important modifications over here are: oral fiber optic intubation is preferred over nasal due to a high nasal viral load. And if nasal fiber optic intubation is required, consider using an endoscopy mask which has a one-way valve through which the fiber optic bronchoscope can be passed nasally. As opposed to the previous airway algorithms where passive oxygenation throughout was recommended, in view of COVID-19, it is recommended to minimize the passive oxygenation wherever possible. Now, in certain children who are severely hypoxic and it is warranted that mask ventilation is required, then the ventilation should be done with low tidal volumes, just enough to give an appreciable chest rise. Always a 2% technique must be used so as to maintain a good seal. Have a low threshold for surgical airway because prolonged attempts at intubation may be associated with increased aerosolization of the virus. Now, before I conclude, I would like to mention the NAP4 audit. This was a difficult airway audit which was conducted in the UK in 2001, and they prospectively measured the significant airway complications, and almost 115,000 patients were included in this audit. So what they found as the common contributors to bad outcome, these are poor airway assessment, poor planning of airway preoperatively. The key component they described is failure to plan for failure, that is, failure to have a backup plan or bailout plan just in case the primary plan fails was found out to be the most important contributor to bad outcome, followed by repeated attempts at intubation, more so in children because they cause severe edema and worsen the situation, and in a child, as we know, even a minimal edema can increase the resistance exponentially. So in the audit, they recommended a change of approach when required and do not attempt the technique that has already failed. The next contributor was lack of basic monitoring like oxygen saturation and capnography, slow response of the anesthetist to hypoxia leading to bradycardia and bradyarrest, and failure to use devices such as supraglottic device or LMA when faced with difficult intubation scenario. So if we see, all these contributors are very much preventable, and if we take adequate precautions, we can definitely reduce the risk of airway complications. So to conclude, what are the golden rules for a compromised airway? Proper preoperative assessment, proper planning, and use of monitoring are essential basic principles for safe anesthesia in children. Have all equipment at hand, and more important, check the equipment before the patient is in the anesthesia room. Get good assistance, and last but the most important, plan ahead and always have a bottom line or a bailout plan ready. In view of Guru Purnima on 5th of July, I would like to greet all the teachers on this forum a very happy Guru Purnima. Thank you once again for this opportunity. Thanks.